She sat in the dim light of the forward operations tent, the faint hum of generators outside mixing with the muffled chatter of soldiers who had just returned from patrol, but her focus was on the long steel weapon laid out across the cleaning cloth in front of her, the Barrett .50, its massive frame gleaming under the yellow light, every inch of it cared for with a precision that spoke of ritual more than necessity, and as she moved the cleaning rod through the barrel with calm, steady motions, her eyes never flinching, it was clear this was not a task but a meditation. The act of keeping the rifle spotless was part of keeping her mind in balance, and those who passed by often paused as one young soldier did tonight, his steps faltering when he caught sight of her hands moving with serene confidence over a weapon that seemed more like an extension of her than a tool, his breath hitching when his gaze fell on the laminated dossier pinned above her cot, a record of confirmed kills, the number etched in thick black ink, 3,247 meters, a shot that had rewritten the unofficial book of legends among snipers. A distance so far that most soldiers could not imagine seeing their target clearly at that range, let alone placing a round with fatal accuracy, and for him, a recruit barely out of training, the sight of this quiet woman cleaning the rifle she had used to carve her name into history was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, but she did not look up, not when he froze in place. Not when his tray clattered faintly against the metal folding table nearby, because her world was narrowed to the rifle and the silence in her own thoughts. And in that silence lived the weight of every shot she had ever taken, each pull of the trigger stretching back years across deserts, forests, and ruined cities, a string of echoes that haunted her even as they defined her, and though she looked calm, though her face was composed, her jawline sharp in the shadow, her eyes carried a heaviness because to hold a record like hers was not only about skill but about the burden of memory, remembering the way the world goes still in the half-second after a trigger pull, remembering the faint puff of dust where a man once stood, remembering the silence that follows after distance erases sound, but she carried that burden because she had to, because her unit had come to rely on her not as just another soldier but as the invisible wall that stood between them and annihilation, and so the Barrett, with its weight that broke men's shoulders and its recoil that demanded both strength and technique, was her companion, her guardian, and her curse, and tonight as she cleaned it she found her mind wandering not to the record that made the others whisper but to the night she had set that shot, that impossible reach across valleys of dust and wind, a night that had begun with a mission briefing no different than countless others, a high-value target embedded deep within enemy territory, surrounded by fighters who would have shredded her team if they advanced, and the order was clear. Take the shot or risk the lives of everyone moving in, and she had lain prone on the rocky ridge, feeling the desert wind cut across her cheek, calculating angles, humidity, temperature drop, rotation of the earth itself, all of it scribbled in the notebook she carried, all of it flowing through her head until the math became instinct, until numbers translated into a calm certainty that her finger would deliver what her mind had already seen, and in that moment she had not thought about records or distances, only about the stillness in her chest, the narrowing of her world into a heartbeat and a crosshair, and when she squeezed the trigger, when the Barrett roared and thunder cracked the sky, she did not see the man fall, not immediately, because at that distance death arrived in silence, seconds late, like an echo chasing the present. But then her spotter whispered hit in a voice thick with disbelief, and the radio carried the exhale of her commander, and she knew even before they confirmed the kill, that the impossible had been done, but she had not smiled, had not allowed herself pride, because she knew one more life had been erased by her hand, and even if that life carried danger for her unit, even if it was a man who would have ordered the death of her brothers in arms, it was still a life, and the ledger she carried in her heart never stopped marking them down, one after another, a silent count she could never show to the world, yet the others spoke of her as though she were carved from steel, as though she were less human and more machine, a myth that moved among them in combat boots, and the young soldier standing frozen tonight felt that same aura, watching the way her hands moved with grace over the rifle's barrel, watching her eyes flick toward him only once, sharp as a blade, before returning to her task, and he swallowed, realizing that the legends whispered in barracks about the calm woman with the Barrett were not exaggerated, realizing that in her silence lived both mastery and ghosts, and though he wanted to speak, to ask her how she had done it, how she had reached across miles and bent a bullet to her will, his voice failed, because standing near her was like standing too close to a storm, you could feel the air shift, heavy with power, and he knew then that she would always be both admired and feared, and as she locked the cleaned barrel into place, running her fingers one last time across the gleaming steel, she whispered something under her breath, a fragment of a prayer or perhaps a name, something he could not catch, and in that moment he understood that she was not cleaning just a weapon but cleansing herself, piece by piece, trying to keep the weight of 3,000 meters of silence from crushing her soul, and though he could not have known it, tonight was only the beginning of the story that would bind his path to hers, for the war was not yet done, and in the days to come he would learn why those who survived alongside her said she was not just a sniper but a shadow of fate itself. The night after she cleaned the Barrett, the camp was restless, helicopters chopping the air above as supply crates came in and wounded were ferried out, and though most soldiers tried to snatch what little sleep they could, she remained awake, lying on her cot with her boots still laced, her rifle propped against the wall beside her like a sentinel, and in the shadows across the room sat the same young soldier who had frozen the evening before, unable to sleep either, his mind replaying the sight of her hands on the weapon and the silent weight of her reputation, and he realized with a kind of awe that he was stationed in the same unit as a legend. Yet the more he watched her, the more he noticed not the myth but the humanity peeking through, the way her eyes blinked longer than normal when the night quieted, as though she was forcing herself not to dream, the way her fingers flexed against the edge of her cot like she was grounding herself, and he wondered what kind of burden it was to carry 3,000 meters of death behind your eyes. But before his thoughts could spiral further, the radio crackled, calling her name with the urgency of fire, and she was on her feet before most men had opened their eyes, Barrett slung over her shoulder, boots striking the dirt as she moved toward the command tent. The young soldier pulled by instinct to follow, though no one asked him, and when he reached the tent flap he caught only fragments of words: convoy ambush, high ground, priority target. But the tone was clear, they needed her because the enemy had trapped a patrol column in the valley road, laying mines and sniper nests along the ridges, and if they tried to push through without her, the loss would be catastrophic. And she nodded once, silent as always before leaving the tent, but this time the commander's eyes followed her with the look of a man both relieved and fearful, because he knew sending her meant someone was about to die. And as the unit scrambled toward their vehicles, the young soldier found himself swept up among them, climbing into the back of an armored truck as the engines roared, dust choking the night, and through the open hatch he could see her in the lead vehicle, unmoving, her silhouette steady against the flashing lights. Barrett laid across her knees like a sleeping predator, and the convoy tore through the desert, the wind biting and sand whipping across their faces until the valley opened before them, a dark maw of cliffs and stone and gunfire already cracking from hidden perches, tracer rounds streaking like angry comets, and the convoy braked hard, soldiers diving for cover, but she did not flinch, stepping out of the truck and moving with that calm, deliberate pace that unsettled even seasoned veterans, climbing the slope with her spotter at her side, while others huddled low, and the young soldier, heart-hammering, crawled after them. Though he had no business there, yet something about her steadiness pulled him forward, as though to watch her work was to glimpse survival itself, and when they reached the ridge she dropped prone, unhurried, unpacking the Barrett with mechanical grace, bipod clamping down into the dirt, scope already turning, and her spotter whispered wind calls while she adjusted her aim. But what astonished him most was her breathing, slow and measured, as though the firefight around them did not exist, as though she was lying in a meadow instead of on a battlefield. And then the Barrett thundered, the recoil rocking her shoulder, dust leaping from the ground, and somewhere across the valley a muzzle flash winked out, silence swallowing one thread of gunfire, and she shifted half an inch, sighting again, the second shot already chambered, another roar, another enemy nest silenced, and in that rhythm she became less human and more elemental, each shot punctuating the night with finality until the cliffside was stripped of hostile fire, and the trapped convoy below began to push forward again, their engines revving in relief. But she did not stop, her eye locked on the scope, searching, hunting, because she knew one would remain, the rival sniper, the one holding back, waiting for her to reveal her position. And when her spotter cursed under his breath, whispering that they were painted, she did not panic, did not twitch, only exhaled long and steady, whispering the numbers of distance and drift like a prayer. And the young soldier beside her realized in horror that the rival was nearly as far as the man she had once killed for her record, hidden deep in the rocks at a range no ordinary shooter would dare attempt. But she adjusted calmly, angling the massive rifle until its barrel pointed at what to his eyes looked like only darkness, and then she stilled, as if her body had dissolved into the earth, and for a heartbeat nothing existed except the crosshair in her scope, the breath leaving her lungs, and the inevitability of a trigger pull. And when the Barrett roared this time, the shot seemed to shake the very valley, and seconds later, so faint he almost thought he imagined it, came the soft collapse of a distant figure, and the spotter's whisper confirmed it, tone laced with awe, target neutralized, and just like that the tension drained from the ridges, the convoy free to move, but she remained prone, eyes lingering on the scope as though searching for Ghosts before finally sitting back, sliding the rifle into its case, her face unreadable, but the young soldier saw something flicker there, not pride, not triumph, but a kind of tired grief, as though each impossible shot only deepened the hole inside her. And when they descended the slope, the men cheered, slapping each other on the back, alive because of her, whispering her name like a talisman, but she walked alone, silent, her shadow stretching long in the floodlights, and the young soldier followed, not sure if he feared her more now or pitied her, but certain that he could not look away, because he had just witnessed what it meant to live in the company of someone who could bend death across miles with nothing more than calm hands and a rifle's whisper. The convoy returned to base under the bruised light of dawn, engines rumbling tiredly and soldiers stumbling out with faces streaked by dust and sweat, and though many collapsed into cots or lined up for the medic to treat burns and cuts, she moved with her usual measured pace, Barrett slung across her back as though the night had been no more than a drill, but inside her chest she felt the weight pressing harder than before, because she knew that every mission where her rifle sang meant another tally in that invisible ledger only she could see, and yet there was no escape because command depended on her, their plans built around the certainty that if they placed her on high ground the impossible would become inevitable, and in war inevitability was worth more than gold. So when the commander intercepted her outside the armory, voice hoarse with exhaustion yet firm with authority, she already knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth: another mission, another hunt, another target marked for her scope, and though his lips tried to dress it with gratitude with phrases like, "You saved them all last night," and, "Only you can do this," she caught the flicker of fear in his eyes, the recognition that they were building her into something less human and more weapon, and she answered with a silent nod, because refusal was not in her nature, nor in her orders, and while she stood there, the young soldier lingered at a distance, his uniform still stained with dirt from crawling after her on the ridge, his body aching but his mind restless, unable to reconcile the calm figure who spoke little with the force he had witnessed unleash thunder into the valley, and against his better judgment he followed her again, not because he was assigned but because something compelled him, a need to understand what drove a person to carry such a burden. And that evening when the sun bled red over the desert horizon and the base settled into its tense quiet, he found her again by her cot, stripping down the Barrett with practiced precision, and this time instead of freezing, he forced himself to step closer, words tumbling from his lips before fear could stop them. "How do you do it? How do you keep steady when the whole world is breaking apart?" And for a long moment she did not reply, her hands moving over the gleaming steel like a ritual, but then her eyes lifted, sharp and unreadable, and she said in a voice low and measured, "You don't steady yourself for the world, you steady yourself for the shot, one breath, one heartbeat, one line across the chaos, everything else is noise." And the simplicity of it struck him harder than any lecture he had heard in training, because he realized she lived her life narrowed to those moments, not days or years or victories, but single breaths stretched into eternity, and though her words were calm, he felt the fracture beneath them, the toll it took to live that way, to shrink your humanity into the space between crosshair and trigger, and he wanted to ask more, wanted to ask if she remembered their faces, if she carried the weight of each man she dropped, but her expression told him those questions would only wound, so he remained silent, watching as she finished the cleaning, locked the rifle away, and lay back with her eyes open, staring at the canvas ceiling like she was searching for answers she knew would never come. And when the next mission arrived it was swifter than expected, a coded transmission intercepted by intelligence, revealing that an enemy commander was traveling through the ruins of a bombed-out city, shielded by a convoy of armored vehicles, and if he reached the fortified zone alive, weeks of Allied strategy would unravel. So once again the order fell to her, and once again she prepared with that ritual calm, but this time the young soldier was formally assigned to the mission, not as her spotter, for she already had one, but as part of the perimeter guard. Yet in his heart he knew the real reason he wanted to be there was to see her work again, to understand whether the first time he had witnessed her power was an illusion born of adrenaline or truly the mark of something beyond ordinary. And as the team infiltrated the shattered city at dusk, moving through streets littered with collapsed walls and rusting vehicles, he stayed close enough to glimpse her silhouette, Barrett balanced against her shoulder like a piece of herself, her gaze scanning windows and rooftops with clinical patience. And when they reached the skeleton of a high-rise that offered a view of the convoy's expected path, she ascended the broken stairs without hesitation, each step deliberate despite the danger of collapse, and at the top she lay prone among the rubble, scope already sweeping the road below, and in that moment the young soldier saw something he had not expected, the faintest shift in her face as the convoy rolled into view, armored vehicles bristling with guns, dust swirling around their wheels, and in the lead truck he caught sight of the enemy commander through his binoculars, a man laughing with his guards as though the war were a game, and he glanced at her, wondering if she felt anything, hatred, anger, disgust, but her expression remained carved from stone, and she whispered to her spotter, confirming wind and distance, adjusting elevation, and then silence fell over their perch, the kind of silence that presses against the lungs as she slowed her breath, the world narrowing again to that single line across chaos, and when the Barrett cracked the night, the sound tore through the ruins like thunder, and the round traveled with lethal inevitability, striking the lead truck's windshield, glass exploding. The commander's laughter cut off mid-breath as his body slumped, and immediately the convoy erupted into panic, guards shouting, vehicles swerving, but she was already shifting, chambering the next round, dismantling the chain of command with methodical precision, her rifle roaring again and again until the street below was chaos, and yet she never faltered, her body steady, her eyes unwavering, until the order was given to withdraw, the mission complete, and as they slipped back through the ruins, the young soldier realized his hands were trembling, not from fear of the enemy, but from the enormity of what he had just witnessed, the way one calm woman lying in rubble could collapse the might of an entire column, and as they reached the extraction point, he looked at her and understood at last that her legend was not a story inflated by rumor but a truth far heavier than most could bear, and though she remained silent, her eyes fixed ahead, he saw in the set of her jaw that she carried not triumph but another weight added to the invisible ledger, another ghost to follow her into the nights to come. The helicopter blades chopped the air as they lifted away from the ruins, the city shrinking beneath them into a jagged skeleton of stone and smoke, and while the others in the extraction bird laughed nervously, their adrenaline bleeding off in shaky relief, she sat rigid against the wall, helmet tilted forward, eyes fixed on nothing, and the young soldier across from her could not stop staring, not because of awe this time but because he was beginning to see the cracks in her armor, the slight tremor that passed through her fingers when she thought no one was watching, the way her breath hitched once before settling again into its practiced rhythm, and he wondered if the others were blind or simply chose not to see, choosing instead to worship the myth she embodied rather than the woman who bled beneath it. But his thoughts were cut short as the pilot's voice broke over the headset, warning of incoming fire, and almost instantly the night sky lit with tracers, the enemy unwilling to let them vanish unscathed, and the helicopter lurched as bullets hammered its side, soldiers gripping straps and bracing against the shuddering frame, but she remained unervingly calm, eyes shifting to the open side door, gauging the angles, and before anyone could speak she unbuckled, dropped to one knee and raised her rifle, the Barrett an impossible weapon to fire from a moving helicopter, yet she aligned it with an ease that made the young soldier's skin prickle, and as the chopper tilted, her shot ripped into the night, the recoil slamming her shoulder but not her aim, and seconds later a flash in the distance signaled the destruction of the enemy's mounted gun, the tracer fire stuttering and then going silent, the men in the cabin staring at her as though they had just seen a ghost, but she only lowered the rifle, braced it against the floor, and adjusted her strap as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and when they finally touched down at base, the cheers of relief from the others rang hollow in her ears, for she already knew another mission would come, another demand for her to carry the weight only she could, and that night, when the base was quiet again, she sat alone outside the barracks, the desert wind cold against her face, Barrett resting across her knees like an anchor, and the young soldier approached cautiously, drawn by something he could not name, and when she didn't turn him away, he sat beside her in silence, listening to the hum of the generators and the faint call of jackals beyond the wire, until finally he asked the question that had been burning in him since the ruins. Do you ever think about what happens after, about what you'll be when the war is over? And for a long moment she didn't answer, eyes fixed on the horizon as if she could see something far beyond it, but then her voice came, low and distant. If the war ever ends, I'll still be carrying it, every shot, every face. You don't walk away from something like this, you just find a quieter place to live with it. And though her words chilled him, they also carried a strange kind of honesty, an acceptance of truth that most soldiers never dared voice, and he realized she was not a machine as others believed but a human being who had made herself into a weapon because someone had to, because the war demanded it, and before he could reply, the alarm klaxons wailed, slicing the night in half, and both of them were on their feet instantly, sprinting toward the armory because the base was under attack, mortars slamming into the perimeter, shaking the earth with each impact, and soldiers poured from their bunks half-dressed, scrambling for weapons, while she moved with terrifying precision, Barrett slung over her shoulder, eyes already scanning the night sky for the telltale arcs of incoming fire, and as the young soldier followed, heart thundering, he realized he was no longer chasing her out of curiosity but out of survival, Because wherever she went was the place you stood the best chance of living. And as the mortars intensified and enemy vehicles approached from the dunes, headlights flickering like predators' eyes, she climbed the nearest guard tower, unfazed by the shells exploding around her, and set the Barrett against the rail, her spotter panting beside her. And within moments her rifle thundered again, round after round tearing through armored trucks before they could breach the wire, each shot precise, each shot the difference between life and death for the men below. And the young soldier, pinned in a trench, looked up. To see her silhouette framed against the burning sky, the long barrel of the Barrett spitting fire like the judgment of some ancient god, and in that moment he understood why the enemy feared her, why rumors of the ghost with the .50 had spread even into their camps, because to them she was not a woman but a phantom death that struck from impossible distances, and as the battle raged for what felt like hours, it was her relentless calm that tipped the balance, her bullets breaking the assault. Until the survivors turned tail and fled into the desert, leaving behind twisted wrecks and silence broken only by the groans of the wounded, and when dawn finally crept over the horizon, painting the sky with pale light, the base stood battered but intact, soldiers alive because of her again, and yet while the others celebrated survival, she descended the tower quietly, face drawn, shoulders heavy, walking past cheers and thanks as though they did not exist, and the young soldier saw her slip into the shadows, seeking solitude where no one could reach her, and he realized then that the more she saved them, the more she withdrew, building walls no bullet could pierce, and though part of him wanted to let her be, another part knew that if someone did not reach her, she would disappear long before the war ended, lost not to enemy fire but to the silence of her own ghosts. The desert winds had not yet swept away the smoke of the night's battle when she found herself called back into the command tent, the maps spread wide across the table, officers bent over them with drawn faces, and though their voices rose with urgency she stood silent, listening as they laid out the next nightmare they would place in her hands. A convoy of Allied medics had been captured during the chaos and was being held in a canyon stronghold, the enemy using them as leverage to stall any advance, and the only way to extract them without losing dozens of men in a frontal assault was to eliminate the canyon's overseer, a warlord whose men worshipped him as untouchable, the kind of figure who kept morale unbroken, and if he fell, the fortress would fracture, its grip on the medics collapsing, and of course all eyes turned to her, because no one else could thread death into a man's heart from the impossible distances he cloaked himself in, and she nodded once, not because she felt eager or ready but because she no longer knew how to refuse, her sense of duty wound so tightly with her identity. That silence was the only answer, and she left the tent with her Barrett already slung across her shoulder, her spotter trailing close, while the young soldier hovered near the entrance, catching her gaze for half a heartbeat, long enough to see the flicker of weariness hidden beneath her calm mask, and before he could step aside she murmured just loud enough for him to hear, "Stay alive," then moved past, and those two words lit something fierce in him, a spark that told him she knew he was following, that she no longer dismissed him as another green recruit but as someone she was reluctantly allowing into her orbit, and as they set out in a small strike team, moving across the dunes in the hush of pre-dawn, he found himself once again near her shadow, the silence between them heavy but not unwelcome, and when they reached the canyon, its jagged walls rising like the ribs of some ancient beast, the plan unfolded with sharp precision, squads moving to cut escape routes while she and her spotter climbed a narrow ridge overlooking the stronghold, and from that perch the young soldier caught his breath at the sight below, enemy tents clustered like insects, fires burning, and in the center a platform where the warlord stood surrounded by guards, his presence commanding even from this distance, and for a moment the young soldier wondered how one person could truly bend the will of so many men, but then he glanced at her and realized he already knew because he had seen how the myth of her rifle held sway over friend and foe alike, and as she lay prone, adjusting for wind that funneled through the canyon like a knife, her spotter whispering calculations, he watched her slip into that trance-like stillness, the world narrowing into numbers and breath, and though gunfire crackled faintly from the far edges as squads engaged, here there was only silence, broken at last by the thunderous roar of the Barrett, the recoil jolting her body yet not her aim, and below the warlord's head snapped back, his body crumpling like a marionette with its strings cut, chaos erupting in the stronghold as men shouted, firing blindly, scattering like ants whose nest had been shattered, and she chambered another round, taking out the guards who scrambled to execute the hostages in panic, each shot ripping through the confusion with merciless precision, and the young soldier could hardly breathe, his ears ringing from the rifle's concussions, his eyes wide as he watched her dismantle the enemy's will with nothing more than her patience and trigger finger, and within minutes the fortress dissolved into disarray, Allied squads rushing in to secure the medics, freeing them while the enemy scattered, leaderless and broken, and though victory should have carried triumph, she only lay back, exhaling, her hand briefly covering her eyes, and he saw for the first time the cost behind the calm, the cracks of exhaustion that no one else noticed, and when they descended the ridge, the medics rushed toward them with gratitude, one of them weeping openly as he gripped her arm, calling her an angel, but she only nodded faintly, eyes distant, as though she were somewhere far away, and the young soldier felt a pang in his chest, because he realized she did not see herself as savior, only as executioner, and later, back at base, when others feasted on the relief of survival, she returned to her cot, pulling the Barrett apart in silence, hands steady even as her shoulders slumped, and he finally dared to sit across from her without waiting for permission, watching her work until he whispered, "You saved them," and for the first time she looked at him fully, her eyes holding his with a weight that rooted him to the spot, and she said quietly, "I saved them, yes, but I also damned myself to one more ghost," then returned to her task, and the word struck him harder than any bullet, because he finally understood that her burden was not simply the lives she took but the endless ledger that she alone could not forgive, and though he wanted to say something to ease it, he found no words, only silence, the same silence she carried with her like a second skin, and in that silence he made a decision, that he would not leave her to carry it alone, no matter how much she tried to push him away, because he could see now that she was human beneath the legend, and if no one else dared to stand beside her, then he would, even if it destroyed him. The convoy moved slowly through the ravine, their engines rumbling against the stone walls that magnified every sound like a drum. Kara lay perfectly still in her nest above, cheek pressed against the cool stock of the Barrett as her eyes tracked the lead vehicle through the shimmering mirage of the afternoon heat. Her breath slowed until it matched the rhythm of her heartbeat, each exhale measured and controlled. She could hear Daniel's faint whisper in her earpiece, reminding her of the angle and wind shift, but she already knew. She had felt it in the subtle sway of the dry grass near her rifle and the way dust particles floated in the air. Every detail registered in her mind like pieces of a puzzle waiting for the final placement. Below, the convoy carried high-value targets. A warlord's chief lieutenant, men who planned ambushes and bombings that had killed countless civilians and soldiers alike. Eliminating them would tilt the balance of this war, and Kara had been given the honor, and the burden, of making it happen. Her finger rested on the trigger guard, not yet squeezing, because she understood that one wrong moment could doom the entire operation. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as she waited for the lieutenant to step out, and when he finally did, brushing the dust off his uniform and giving orders to his guards, Kara felt her world narrow into a single point of focus. Her scope crosshairs locked on the man's temple, and her mind went silent. The recoil hit her shoulder with a brutal punch, the shockwave rippling across the cliffside, but the shot was perfect. The man's body crumpled before his guards even realized what had happened, panic surging through the convoy as Kara immediately chambered the next round. She was no longer human in that moment, she was a machine, efficient and unrelenting, each shot tearing through enemy after enemy as vehicles screeched to a halt and men scattered into the rocks for cover. Daniel fed her updates from below, calling out movements she could not see, and Kara's rifle answered them with precise depth. Yet she also felt something unfamiliar stir inside her chest as the chaos unfolded, a tightness that wasn't fear but an awareness that each squeeze of her finger ended another life. She pushed the thought aside, forcing herself into the cold discipline drilled into her bones, because hesitation was death out here. Minutes stretched like hours until the last enemy survivor fled into the desert, abandoning the burning wreckage of the convoy. Kara slowly lifted her cheek from the scope, exhaling long and deep, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. "Targets neutralized," she whispered, though her voice betrayed none of the storm she felt inside. Daniel's voice came back, hushed with awe, telling her she had once again done the impossible. But Kara wasn't listening to the praise. Her eyes were locked on the smoke rising from the convoy, and for the first time in years, she wondered what kind of person she was becoming. Back at base, her name spread quickly, soldiers whispering of the woman who had destroyed an entire convoy with nothing more than patience, steel, and a single Barrett .50. Some called her an angel of death, others a ghost. But to Kara, who cleaned her rifle in silence while the mess hall buzzed with stories, it felt less like glory and more like weight. Daniel found her later, sitting alone by the barracks, and he asked if she was all right. She gave him the same steady nod she always did, though in truth she wasn't sure. He sat beside her anyway, offering no words, only quiet presence. That small act of humanity reminded her that she was not entirely lost to the machine she pretended to be. But she also knew the war wasn't finished. Command had already sent word of new orders, even riskier than before, and deep down Kara sensed that her record, her reputation, had painted a target on her back as much as it had honored her. Enemies whispered her name now too, and they were coming for her. She could feel it in her bones like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, inevitable and merciless. The battlefield was never satisfied with one victory, it always demanded another. The storm Kara had felt building finally came to life 2 weeks later when the base was struck in the dead of night. The first explosion tore through the vehicle depot, shaking the ground beneath her bunk, throwing her from sleep into instant awareness. Alarms blared as fire lit the sky, painting the canvas of darkness with orange fury. Kara grabbed her Barrett and sidearm, boots hitting the dirt before her mind had even caught up. Shouts echoed through the camp, men scrambling for weapons, medics rushing toward the smoke, commanders barking orders into radios that already crackled with static. The enemy had come prepared, and Kara knew they hadn't attacked just to bleed resources. They had come for her. She could feel it like a knife point against her spine, the whisper of vengeance carried in the shadows. Daniel appeared out of the haze, rifle slung across his chest, face streaked with sweat and grime, and he fell into step beside her without question. Together they moved toward the southern wall, where gunfire rattled against steel like rain against a tin roof. Enemy fighters poured through the breach, shadows dancing in the firelight, but Kara dropped to one knee, leveled her Barrett and turned the chaos into order one shot at a time. Each pull of the trigger was thunder, bodies flung backward as the massive rounds found their marks, yet no matter how many she felled, more kept coming, crawling over the wreckage like ants drawn to spilled sugar. The air was thick with smoke and blood, the stench sharp and unrelenting, and still she held the line. Daniel covered her flanks, shouting warnings she could barely hear over the roar, until at last command ordered them to retreat to the inner compound. Kara hesitated, every instinct screaming to hold, but Daniel's hand on her shoulder pulled her back. "We can't save the wall," he yelled. "But we can save the base." She gave a sharp nod, scooping up her spent shell casings as always, and together they fell back through the maelstrom. Inside the compound, the defenders regrouped, heavy machine guns mounted on sandbags, mortars thumping into the night, but Kara knew this wasn't a battle. They were caught in a hunt. Somewhere out there was a sniper like her, patient, watching, waiting. She felt the unseen eyes even as she took her position on the rooftop, her own scope sweeping the ridgelines beyond the firelight. Minutes bled into hours as the attack surged and waned, then surged again. Each time Kara fired, she wondered if the shot she didn't see would finally come for her. At dawn, the assault broke, the enemy retreating into the mountains, leaving behind scorched earth and bodies. The base was standing but barely. Kara sat on the roof long after the last echo of gunfire faded, her cheek pressed against the stock of her rifle, eyes locked on the ridges. She knew this was only the beginning. Later in the debrief, the commander confirmed her fears. Intercepted transmissions suggested that a rival sniper had been dispatched specifically to kill her. A shadow from the other side, trained, lethal, determined. Kara felt no fear at the news, only a cold acceptance. Every legend invited a challenger, every ghost eventually drew another ghost. Daniel looked at her, concern etched into his face, and asked if she was ready for that. Kara gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I've been ready my whole life," she said, though the words carried a weight he couldn't understand. That night, as the base rebuilt its defenses and soldiers whispered of survival, Kara sat alone with her Barrett, cleaning every piece until it gleamed. Her hands were steady, her mind focused, but deep inside she felt the pull of destiny tightening around her throat. She had walked too far down this path to turn back, and now the battlefield itself had chosen her final opponent. She thought of the convoy, of the lives she had ended, of the smoke and the silence after, and she wondered if the universe demanded balance. Perhaps this rival sniper was not just an enemy but her reflection, her equal, the one who would either end her story or push her to carve an even darker legend into the stone of war. As the stars wheeled overhead and the fires of the day died to embers, Kara whispered to herself, "Let them come." The silence before dawn was broken only by the soft click of Kara locking the final piece of her Barrett into place. The base lay in uneasy quiet, the kind that comes after a storm but before the next, soldiers dozing in shifts, engineers hammering plates into the breaches, the air heavy with smoke and fatigue. Kara sat on the edge of the roof, eyes fixed on the dark ridgelines where she knew her hunter waited. She had studied the enemy's patterns, traced the faint arcs of their probing attacks, and she understood that tonight was not about raids or explosives, it was about her. Somewhere out there, beyond the veil of dust and rock, Another sniper was breathing slow and steady, scope trained not on the base but on the rooftop where she sat cleaning her rifle. She could feel it like a ghost at her shoulder, a pressure that settled on her skin. Daniel joined her quietly, setting down a thermos of bitter coffee, but his eyes held none of the casual steadiness she remembered from before. He knew as she did that this duel was different. This wasn't war, it was execution, and one of them would not see another sunrise. "You could step back," he said softly, not as a commander but as a friend. "Let someone else take this fight." Kara's eyes flicked to him, cold and unwavering. "This fight was always mine," she replied, her voice flat as steel. When the sun's first light crept over the horizon, Kara was already prone, Barrett stretched out before her, scope aligned with the jagged rocks across the valley. Hours passed with no movement, no sound but the occasional buzz of flies over the wreckage below. Her body ached but she did not shift. She became stone, her breathing measured, eyes unblinking. Then, just as the heat shimmer began to rise from the desert floor, she saw it, the faintest glint, a reflection no longer than a heartbeat, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. Her pulse quickened, but her finger did not move. She waited, knowing that the other sniper was doing the same, two predators locked in stillness, each daring the other to make the first mistake. Time dissolved into a blur of tension, the valley itself holding its breath. Finally, a whisper of dust rose near the ridge, too subtle for anyone else to notice, but to Kara it was as clear as a flare. She exhaled, shifted her aim a fraction of a degree and squeezed. The Barrett roared, recoil slamming her shoulder, and she saw stone shatter where the rival had been hidden. For a moment she thought it was over, but then another shot cracked, a near miss that split the sand inches from her cheek. Adrenaline surged through her veins, sharp and electrifying. This was no ordinary opponent, they were her equal. The duel began in earnest, shots echoing across the valley, each one precise, each one a breath away from death. Kara rolled, shifted, fired, moved again, every instinct tuned to survival and destruction. She felt the presence of her rival in every shift of the wind, every echo of stone, as if their souls were bound together in this deadly rhythm. Hours dragged on, neither gaining advantage, until the sun bled low and shadows stretched across the valley floor. Kara's body screamed with exhaustion, but her mind remained locked, cold and clear. She thought of the convoy, the base, the lives she had taken, and she understood this was the culmination of it all. Not glory, not revenge, but the final test of what she had become. As twilight fell, she spotted it, a flaw, a hesitation. The rival shifted too far to adjust for wind, exposing the smallest curve of a helmet above the ridge. Kara did not hesitate. Her shot was thunder, and the silence that followed was absolute. Dust hung in the air, drifting lazily as if time itself had stopped. Kara kept her eye to the scope, waiting, but there was no counterfire, no movement. Slowly she exhaled, the weight of 1,000 battles pressing down on her chest. Daniel's voice crackled in her earpiece, tight with relief. "Is it done?" Kara didn't answer at first. She pulled herself upright, legs trembling, Barrett heavy in her hands. She looked out across the valley, where the body of her rival lay hidden in shadow, and she felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Only silence. She turned to Daniel and finally whispered, "It's done." Back at base, the soldiers would tell the story for years. The sniper duel that ended with Kara still standing, the ghost of the valley who could not be killed. They would call her a legend, a myth, a weapon made flesh. But Kara, sitting alone with her rifle that night, knew the truth. Each shot, each kill, had carved away pieces of her soul until there was little left but the echo of steel and smoke. She was alive, yes, but she was also hollow, her humanity buried beneath the weight of her record. Daniel found her there, as he always did, and though he said nothing, his presence kept her tethered to the world. Kara stared at the stars above, endless and cold, and wondered if she had finally reached the end of her path or if the war would demand even more. She did not know, and perhaps it did not matter. She had survived, and survival was its own curse. In the darkness, she whispered only to herself, "One day the bullet will find me. Until then I wait." The end.